Hello, this is Heather Hoffman, and today I have another fall themed card to share using the August 2021 Kit of the Month from Unity Stamp Company. I am going to use some watercolor cardstock and some watercolor markers kind of in two different ways. I started off there with that lovely little row of pumpkins. I'm using Strathmore watercolor paper, and I'm going to stamp this in watercolor friendly pigment ink. I'm going to end up using VersaFine ONYX Black. It's one I found that works really well with watercolors, and also is one of the easier ones to get a good crisp black impression on watercolor paper. The texture on there can make it sometimes a little tricky to get all the detail. I also really love using a stamp positioner because it allows me to stamp multiple times to get all of those details on there. One stamp isn't too bad, but doing it multiple times is just going to get that image more and more clear. And that's just a microfiber cloth that I use for cleaning my blending brushes, and it gives me a little bit of something just easier on my hand to kind of rub and press that down. All right, here's that full set of those Karin Marker Pro, whatever you call them, brush marker, there we go. And I'm giving you a little closer look at each of the colors that I ended up using. I'm only using 5 colors, 2 for each blend, mainly on the pumpkin and then the green on the leaves. And I'm kind of just holding them together in my hand because I wanted to be able to blend them fairly quickly before the ink had too much time to dry on there. I'm not using any water for my blending. I'm doing these just with a nice bold choice of colors. And I went over pretty much the majority with my lighter color marker, and then I came in with my darker one and added the little bit of shading around the edges, and then blended back a little bit again at the end there with that lighter color. All right. So I did these first couple pumpkins before I realized it would probably be a little helpful to zoom in. So I went ahead and zoomed in a little closer and sped this up just a little bit more so you can just quickly see as I go across and do all my colors. Again, I'm only blending with the 2 colors. It's a really nice bold blend, but I like how the colors just sort of blend on their own. I don't really have to do much. At the beginning, I think I came in more with my lighter color to blend back. And as I got to the end, I really realized I kind of didn't need to do that. It sort of just blended on its own. And I came back in at the end with a little more of that dark color to kind of blend a little more behind, like each of the pumpkins, where you would kind of have a shadow on the pumpkin that's falling behind a little bit from the pumpkin in the front. So you'll see a little bit there and a little bit kind of just tucked behind, just that one little extra bit that kind of adds to that realism in the scene. All right, then there's just a couple little spots with leaves, so I just colored those with my lighter color, added a teensy tiny bit of shading with the darker color, and then finished off the stems with the brown color. And once that's all finished, we're going to use these markers to also watercolor in a bit on the background for a perfectly blended look, and just another way that you can use these markers. So I just scribbled them onto a clear stamp block. I'm actually using a glass mat, so I could use that as well, or a paint palette, or whatever you want to do. And then I have a bowl of water there, and I'm just picking up a little water with a wet brush, and then using that to dip into those scribbles that I have there of the markers, and picking up the color kind of like I would off of a paint palette or anything different. So again, just kind of a fun way to add a little more color and know that it'll perfectly coordinate. And another option, even if you wanted to color these pumpkins softer, you could use the same technique of just scribbling onto a clear block or something and picking up the color with a wet brush and then just blending it a little more like traditional watercolors. So I kind of like when you have one thing and you can stretch it more than one way. I also came in a little with the brown. I didn't love that as much once I put it on. I was kind of trying to go around and soften and distress the edges. As it was, I pretty much ended up trimming all that off anyway. I used a rectangle die to die cut this down once I set it aside and let it dry. But I blended it in enough that it wasn't horrible. But you know, sometimes you do something and just think, well, why did I bother doing that? So like I said, in this case, I pretty well trimmed off and I didn't have to worry about it anyway. All right, now it's time to add a sentiment. So I went ahead and picked a sentiment from the kit that just was fun to fit in that perfect little nook there above the shorter pumpkins. I always like to use the grid on my MISTI just to make sure that my sentiment is straight and doesn't go on crooked. Sometimes it's tricky to show with red rubber, so I put it on the best I can, and then I double check on my grid so that I know it's going to stamp exactly where I want it. All right, now that is all finished. I pulled out a card base that I created with some Lawn Fawn cardstock in Speckled Egg, kind of just a little bit of a rustic cream cardstock. And then I grabbed some white cardstock and I'm just tearing the edges to add a little layer to make it pop a little bit more and add a tiny bit of texture. So I kind of tore all the edges and then I'm adjusting it down to make it the size I want. I felt like that was still a little long over there. I almost afterwards wished I'd left a little more on the side, but it still worked out fine and left enough of a border to keep that texture all the way around. So I'm going to use some foam adhesive, but I went ahead and adhered this down directly onto that white, mostly because I wanted to be able to make sure that that white little torn edge showed all the way around my watercolor panel. I'm using really sturdy Scor-Tape. I like to use sturdy adhesive with watercolor paper since adding the water and the coloring and then the heaviness of the paper tends to just make it a little trickier to hold down. So I'm going to adhere that down like that. And then that entire panel, once it's adhered down, I can go ahead and use some foam adhesive to add that down. So I'm pulling out my big roll of foam tape. Normally I use pre-done panels, but I was out of those, so I just used lots of foam tape. And that is finished, our nice simple card. Thanks so much for coming by. I hope you enjoyed and have a wonderful day.